Thank you, Bryce. So this year's theme for our lecture series is the future of citizenship. We have a number of excellent speakers, and Professor Lewis is will be a remarkable speaker for us today. Citizenship is an interesting topic and one that's very relevant for us today because it helps us to think about ideas of belonging, responsibility, and civic participation. And by re-examining it, we can have a better understanding of how we can open paths towards peace, justice, and stronger democratic culture. Today's lecture, Constitutional Pluralism and Peacemaking, is co-sponsored by the American Studies program. And our speaker, Verlan Lewis, comes for us from way across town at UVU, at Utah Valley University, Community College. I almost showed how old I am. He's an associate professor of the political science department there. He teaches courses on American political thought, institutions, and development. His writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Cambridge and Oxford University Presses, Political Science Quarterly, and Presidential Studies Quarterly. Professor Lewis earned his degree from Brigham Young University in American Studies, from Cambridge University and the University of Virginia. He's also been an academic fellow at Stanford and Harvard University. His most recent book that he's co-authored, The Myth of the Left and Right, argues that the familiar left and right political spectrum harms America by undermining constitutional government and peacemaking. Today, man, I've promoted you already. Today, Professor Lewis will explore how moving beyond these categories may open up new possibilities in pluralism and civic peace. So please join me in welcoming Professor Verlan Lewis.
Thanks so much, Scott. It's really an honor to be here today, to see many friends in the audience, and to be a part of this Future of Citizenship lecture series. I have to admit, sometimes when I think about the future of citizenship in the United States and in the world more broadly, I get a little depressed. As I think about the ways that we talk about politics with each other, what's happening with political violence in our community and around the world. But I also get some hope and I get some optimism when I come to places like this, where I see students and I see the possibility for younger people to not make the same mistakes that my generation made. When I was growing up in the 90s, I was told that the way to think and talk about politics was through a one-dimensional left-right political spectrum. My teachers taught this to me, my college professors taught this to me. They thought this is the best way to think and talk about politics. Unfortunately, I think that way of thinking and talking about politics has led us to some of the problems that we have in our political discourse and in our political communities today. But you all have the power to change that trajectory. That we can change the way that we talk to each other, we can change the way that we think about each other, and we can, I think, decrease the amount of anger and hostility that we have in our political society. I also want to say what an honor it is to be here at Brigham Young University. As Dr. Sanders said, I'm an alumnus of Brigham Young University. I love this campus. So many fond memories. This is a bit of a back to the future moment for me. So 20 years ago, I was sitting where you're sitting right now as an American Studies major, and had wonderful professors. Some of them are here in the room. Dr. Carrie Soper, if any of you get a chance, take a class from Dr. Soper. You won't regret it. And I have an old roommate who I also majored in American Studies with here at BYU, who now teaches. So Paul Lambert, if you get a chance, take a class from Dr. Lambert. You will not regret it. Okay, so I want to begin with a little bit of bad news, and then hopefully we can finish with some more optimism or some more hope. But the bad news is what you all know, which is that there is a lot of hate fueling our politics today. You've noticed this anecdotally in your own experiences, in the way that you've engaged with family members, with your neighbors, with people in your community, with people in your ward. You've noticed this in the way that you've engaged with people online, that there is a lot of hate fueling our politics. And the survey data backs up what you have experienced anecdotally. This is from the Pew Research Center, asking people who identify as Republicans and Democrats how they feel about the other political party. And you will not be surprised to find that over the last 30 years, the percentage of Republicans with a very unfavorable view of the Democratic Party has tripled. Likewise, the percentage of Democrats with a very unfavorable view of the Democratic Party has tripled. So just 30 years ago, these numbers were pretty small in the teens, but now it's a solid majority of partisans in both of our two major political parties. Another way of measuring this is from the American National Election Studies. They've asked people for the past 6 decades to rate how they feel about the Democratic and Republican parties on a 0 to 100 feeling thermometer. What you'll notice at the top of this graph, the solid red and blue lines, is the way that Democrats feel about other Democrats, the way that Republicans feel about other Republicans. And you'll notice that that's a pretty straight line. It hasn't changed much over the last 60 years. But what has changed and what has dropped off dramatically over the past 6 decades are the dotted red and blue lines. That's the way that Democrats feel about Republicans and that Republicans feel about Democrats. And whereas in the 1960s, there was a over 50 average feeling thermometer rating for the cross-partisans in American politics, that is above 50, a basically positive feeling towards people of the other political party, that has cratered in recent decades to the teens. So this is something that we've all noticed, and it's something that a former BYU president and soon-to-be president of the Church of Jesus Christ has noted. He spoke about this in October of 2020 in a general conference of the church. He said, "We live in a time of anger and hatred in political relationships. In a democratic government, we will always have differences over proposed candidates and policies. However, as followers of Christ, we must forego the anger and hatred with which political choices are debated or denounced in many settings." So President Oakes is teaching us that, of course, it's normal to have differences of opinion when it comes to politics, when it comes to deliberating over political choices, candidates, policies, but we must not do so in a way that is angry or hateful. In his final address to the membership of the church, our beloved prophet, President Nelson, who recently passed away, this was his final message. He said, "2 years ago, I called upon us as covenant followers of Jesus Christ to be peacemakers. I repeat what I said then. Anger never persuades. Hostility builds no one. Contention never leads to inspired solutions. True charity towards all men is the hallmark of peacemakers. It is imperative that we have charity in our discourse, both public and private. The present hostility in public dialogue and on social media is alarming." President Nelson was a seer. He saw around corners, and he saw what we're going through right now. We must change the way that we talk to each other. We need to change our discourse. We need to change our dialogue. Clearly, something is broken with the way that we speak to each other about politics. Okay, so that you might ask the question, well, how can I become a peacemaker? How can I follow President Nelson's counsel? Well, I would suggest there's 2 things that you can do. And the first, and most importantly, is that you can pray for charity. As described in Moroni chapter 7, we can ask God to fill our hearts with charity. But in addition to that, I think there's also truths that we can learn that can change the way that we think about other people and the way that we talk to other people and talk about other people. President Packer taught that true doctrine changes attitudes and behavior quicker than a study of behavior improves behavior. So we need to learn truth and reject false doctrine. We need to learn the truth of pluralism and the fallacy of monism. That's what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to describe to you how the way that most of us, probably everyone in this room, typically thinks and talks about politics is a false, misleading, and harmful way of talking about politics, and show a better way that we can think and talk about politics. Okay, so this has to do with the book that I published with my brother a couple years ago. He's definitely the first author and deserves the lion's share of the credit or blame, as you may see fit, for the ideas that we put forward in our book. But this is what I'm going to be talking about today, the myth of left and right. I don't think the myth of left and right is the only thing that's causing the anger, the hostility, and the violence that we see in our society, but I think it's one of the things that no one is talking about. It's one of the big overlooked problems in our political culture. Okay, so what is the monist fallacy that I've referred to? What is the myth of left and right? Well, this is something that you all know. This is like water to a fish. It's something we all inhabit. We use these terms on a daily basis. If you turn on cable news, if you have the misfortune of scrolling through social media, if you open a newspaper, you will see these terms: liberal, conservative, radical, reactionary, left, right. This is the vocabulary of our political discourse. The problem is it's based entirely upon a lie. There is no left-right spectrum. It doesn't exist. This is a false social construct. Now, the typical way people think about this one-dimensional line, the way that your teachers probably told you, is they said, well, on the left side of the spectrum are people who are in favor of change. And if you're moderately in favor of change, then you're a liberal on the center left or a progressive. Or if you're radically in favor of change, then you're a radical on the far left. Likewise, if you're moderately against change, you're a conservative on the center right. Or if you're extremely against change, you're a reactionary on the far right. And so this is the way people typically talk about our politics. And you might be able to put the Democratic and Republican parties somewhere on here, and you might be able to put communists and fascists somewhere on here. This is the way most people think and talk about politics. Well, this is just false. Most notably and obviously because our politics is not one-dimensional. We don't have just one issue in politics. We have many issues in politics. This is just an example from the Pew Research Center. They asked people recently, what do you think should be a top priority for the national government to address this year? And people gave lots of different answers because there isn't just one issue in politics. Some people said the economy, others said healthcare, others said the coronavirus, others said education, social security, terrorism, crime, and on and on and on. There are literally hundreds of issues in our politics, not just one. So why would we use a one-dimensional spectrum to describe a multidimensional reality? Well, people who defend the left-right political spectrum will say, yes, it's true, of course, that there are many issues in politics, but the reason that a one-dimensional spectrum is useful and helpful is because all of those issues are bound together by one essence. And so your stance on the one big issue determines your stance on the hundreds of smaller issues. So he said, yes, it's true that there is tax cuts and abortion policy and tariffs and aid to Ukraine. Those are all different issues, but they're bound together by an essence. And where you are on the one-dimensional spectrum, say change, if that's what we want to say is the thing dividing the left and the right, that determines your issue positions on the hundreds of other issues. And I want to suggest to you today that that is actually not true. I mean, just think about change, for example, if that's what we believe is the one thing determining all the issue positions of Team Blue and Team Red. Is it really true that the Democratic Party wants to change everything and the Republican Party wants to maintain the status quo on everything? Take maybe a hot-button issue like abortion. For most of my life, it was Republicans who called themselves conservatives on the right who wanted to change the status quo on abortion policy. They wanted to overturn Roe v. Wade. Up until a couple years ago, they were the party that wanted change, and it was Democrats who called themselves progressives on the left who wanted to maintain the status quo on that policy. Now, of course, they've switched. You can go through any issue and you can come up with a story to describe why Team Blue is in favor of change and Team Red is against change, but they're really just stories. They're not predictive, and social science has to be predictive in order to be useful, of the issue positions that people take. Of course, the very positions that our two parties take on the various issues are constantly changing. So if we go back to this left-right spectrum, I'll just give an example of why this left-right spectrum is misleading. Take a famous BYU alumnus, for example. Mitt Romney graduated from BYU back when my parents were attending BYU here, and went on to be a senator from Utah and the Republican Party's 2012 presidential candidate. Now, you remember what issue positions Romney and the Republican Party stood for just 13 years ago. Romney was famously in favor of decreasing entitlement spending and decreasing federal deficits. He and his vice presidential candidate, Paul Ryan, made that a very big part of their campaign. We need to cut government spending, we need to decrease deficits, we need to cut entitlement spending. Most people would say, okay, so Brother Romney is a moderate conservative on the center right. This is the false framework that most people use. And they'd say, Donald Trump, the current leader of the Republican Party, the current president, is an extreme conservative on the far right. So if we use the left-right spectrum, of course Donald Trump must be extremely against entitlement spending and extremely against deficit spending. But what is the reality? That's the lie that the left-right spectrum tells us. The reality is that he has increased entitlement spending and increased and given us record federal deficits. Or take another issue. Romney was famously moderately in favor of free trade. So does that mean that Trump, as an extreme conservative, wants to take Romney's moderate position to the extreme and he's an extreme free trader? No, just the opposite. He has increased protectionist tariffs on imports since becoming president. So does that mean that Trump has moved the Republican Party to the left by being a protectionist? No, it simply means he's redefined what the Republican Party stands for and what conservatism means. These terms are constantly changing. Or take foreign policy, if we don't want to talk about economic policy. When it comes to foreign policy, Romney was, of course, moderately in favor of using military force and military strength to spread democracy abroad, was opposed to Russia, wanted to help Ukraine in its defense against attacks from Russia. So does that mean that Trump has taken Romney's moderate position to the extreme, and he's extremely in favor of using military force against Russia and extremely in favor of aid to Ukraine? No, just the opposite. He has opposed those efforts to aid Ukraine. So does that mean that Trump has moved the Republican Party to the left? No, he's simply redefined what the Republican Party means. These terms, left and right, are useless for us in describing the terrain of our political reality. Okay, so there are many issues in politics. Now, what we have to explain then is, why do certain issues go with other issues? Because it is true, if I find out your position on, say, abortion, I know you're pro-life on abortion policy maybe, for example, then I have, with better than 50% accuracy, an ability to guess your position on a host of other issues. I can guess that you're also in favor of protectionist trade policy. I can also guess that you're in favor of lower income taxes. I can also guess that you're opposed to aid to Ukraine. Now, why is it that I can guess those things about you? Is it because you have some conservative philosophy that dictates all of those different issue positions that you've bundled together as a Republican or as a conservative? No, it's because you've been socialized into the tribe that has taken on those issue positions. The same thing if I found out that you're pro-choice on abortion policy. I could guess with better than 50% accuracy your stance on being in favor of aid to Ukraine and being in favor of free trade and being opposed to tax cuts. But is that because there's some philosophy, some progressive philosophy that's determining those things? No, it's because of the socialization that you get once you anchor into a political tribe, either because there's one issue you really care about or because of your family or peers you've anchored into a particular political tribe, and you will take on the issue positions of your tribe as a matter of course. And you will even change your own issue positions to go along with the way in which your tribe changes. So in the 1990s, for example, it used to be that Republicans thought character mattered a great deal in elected officials. There's survey data saying that Republicans and people who called themselves conservatives cared more about that than Democrats or people who called themselves progressives. That has now switched. The survey data now says that Democrats care more about character in elected officials than Republicans. Is that because some conservative or progressive philosophy has forced that? Or that Republicans have now become liberals and Democrats have now become conservatives? No, it's simply they've changed their issue positions to justify what the leader of their tribe is doing. So this is the way that we use this nonsensical language of left and right. So there is no essence binding together all the issue positions that currently fly under the banners of left or right. Those issue positions are constantly changing. We can come up with stories to say why being in favor of free trade is progressive or why being in favor of protectionism is progressive, and we can change the story all the time. But this is not social science, this is not predictive, this is simply storytelling, no different from astrology. So what we do have evidence for is not the monist essentialist theory that says there's just one issue and there's some essence that binds together the hundreds of issues in politics. What we do have evidence for is the pluralist social theory, that people join a political tribe and adopt the issue positions of that tribe as a matter of course. There's survey data that shows this. So interestingly, if you ask people what their issue positions are, you will find some correlation between your view on abortion policy and tax policy and foreign policy, for example. But guess what? Not that much, and only among college-educated people. Only people who have been told that this is what goes together with this find that they have constraint or correlation between those different issue positions. If your teacher or college professor never told you that being in favor of generous welfare benefits goes along with being pro-choice on abortion policy, then there is no correlation. So think about that for a second. This correlation between issue positions only exists among the people who have been told that they should think in that way. These correlations do not exist in nature. So it would be like, it's very much like astrology. Imagine if you had a group of people that read their horoscope every day, and they knew what was supposed to be the characteristics of someone born their month of the year. Say they're a Leo. Okay, I'm supposed to be brave because I'm a Leo. What if you only found that characteristic among the people who regularly read their horoscope? That's not something that exists in nature. It's not natural, right? This is nonsense. Astrology is absolute nonsense. But you can find a correlation if people believe the nonsense. And that's what we have with left-right spectrum. It's utter nonsense that with correlations that only exist because people believe the nonsense. The historical record is also very clear on this. The meanings of progressive and conservative are constantly changing. You can take any issue. I'm happy to go through in Q&A. I don't have time here. The two parties have switched their positions on virtually every issue in American politics. The conservative and progressive tribes have switched their positions on virtually every issue. And then we have some very interesting experimental results on this as well. We even have some political scientists here at BYU who have done political experiments to prime people to see what their issue positions are based on certain cues that they get. So Jeremy Pope and Michael Barber in the political science department would have a treatment group and a control group. They'd bring people into a room and ask them, do you think of yourself as a Republican or a Democrat? Do you think of yourself as a conservative or a progressive? And what are your issue positions? And what they found is that people who strongly identified as conservatives or progressives were very easily moved in their issue positions based on the cues that they received. And the cue that they received was very interesting. They had a series of quotes from the most famous politician in America today, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, where he took a stance on a variety of issues: minimum wage, taxes, entitlement spending, whatever it is. And they would give some people a cue saying that Donald Trump was in favor of all these things, and other people a different treatment saying he was against all these things. The funny thing about Trump is they didn't actually have to make up the quotes. So normally in a political experiment, political scientists, we trick our subjects and we make up things that aren't true. But Trump has actually taken both sides of every issue. There are actual quotes where he has been in favor and against all of these things. So they used real quotes, and people who strongly identified as progressive or conservative would change their own issue position based on that treatment. What Pope and Barber were expecting is that strong partisans would switch their issue positions, but not strong ideologues. They thought there was something different between partisanship and ideology. What they found is that ideology is just like partisanship. It's just a social group marker. It's not a philosophical or principled marker of a set of ideas. So that is what explains the issue constraint. Now, people will tell me, and we can talk about this in Q&A if you want, that you're missing it. It's not really change versus conservation. That's the one big issue that defines left and right. It's something else. It's big versus small government, or it's arrogance versus humility, or it's autonomy versus control. But the fact that people come up with hundreds of different essences to define the left and right indicates to me the truth that there's more than one issue in politics. These are all important issues that people take into consideration. There isn't just one. I once had a political scientist tell me, well, the real difference between liberals and conservatives is conservatives care about the Constitution and liberals don't. Okay? Well, that indicates to me what side of the spectrum he identified with, but it didn't tell me anything meaningful about the actual difference between progressives and conservatives. I had another political scientist at a conference tell me once, well, the real difference between progressives and conservatives is progressives care about poor people and conservatives don't. Well, you can guess which side of the spectrum he identified with, but nothing substantive or real about the differences between Team Blue and Team Red. Okay, so this is the problem that we have in our political discourse, and it dominates all of our news media. This is just a few weeks ago I was giving a presentation in British Columbia, so I just looked at some headlines from the Wall Street Journal, from the New York Times, And this is the headlines we see over and over. Virtually every article you read, virtually every news segment that you watch uses the language of left and right, conservative and progressive. Donald Trump in particular loves the language of left and right. He is constantly talking about the lunatic radical left and how we need to beat the hell out of them, to use his words. Right? This is the way that people talk about politics. Okay, so can you imagine a world without a left-right spectrum? Well, yes, we can, because for 99% of human history, we have not had a left-right spectrum. It was an invention of the French Revolution. It spread around Europe a little bit in the 19th century, and it came to America, unfortunately, in the 1920s and 30s. This is just from Google Ngram. You can do this yourself to see the prevalence of the usage of these terms, right-wing and left-wing, in English language publications. It starts taking off in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, and now it's increased exponentially at the turn of the 21st century. For most of American history, we didn't use this language. Your great-grandparents did not use the language of left and right. They never talked about progressives and conservatives. We had two major parties that stood for a basket of issue positions that were constantly changing, but no one pretended that you could place an individual, a group, or a party on a one-dimensional political spectrum. So this has come to America just in the past century, and it's done, I believe, great harm to both our brains and our souls. It's decreased our intelligence, and it's decreased our civic charity toward our fellow citizens. So I'll just talk briefly about how it hurts our brains. If you want to be smarter, an easy way to do as you walk out the door is just stop using left-right language. Stop thinking about politics in terms of progressives and conservatives. You will instantly increase your IQ by several points. The research shows that people who use left-right thinking are less able to effectively accomplish cognitive tasks. They're less able to spot errors or logical fallacies. They're less able to reason logically. Now, this isn't to say that anyone who uses a left-right framework is a stupid person. It just means they'd be smarter if they gave it up. Why is that? Well, one of the reasons is the dogmatism that monism brings about. If you believe that all of politics can be flattened onto a one-dimensional line, then you believe that all of your issue positions flow out of being correct about the one big thing. You chose the correct side of the spectrum, and that made everything else correct, because all of them are bound together by an essence. Well, think about what that does to our minds. It makes us believe that we have to agree with our tribe on everything. Our tribe and our party can't be wrong about anything. Because if it was wrong, it wouldn't just be wrong about that one thing, it would have to be wrong about everything, because that would mean they were wrong about the one big thing. And so this leads to dogmatism. It makes our minds like a house of cards. We can't allow any one card to be removed without the entire edifice collapsing on us. And so we become dogmatic defenders of our party's doctrine, rather than curious seekers of truth. It also creates mental prisons. The left-right spectrum says that there's only two ways to think about politics. There's only two approaches to political problems. And so when you inhabit this mental prison, you say, there's just my tribe's correct way of approaching this political issue, and the other tribe's wrong way of approaching this political issue. Well, that's a mental prison. What we need are third and fourth and fifth and sixth ways of thinking about a variety of political problems that beset our politics. It also leads to confirmation bias. Because we are so concerned about our house of cards collapsing, we have an incentive to simply confirm everything that we already believe rather than challenge our priors. And this leads us into media echo chambers. You'll notice, probably you've noticed this, that our media landscape is dominated by companies who identify as part of Team Blue or Team Red. Right? This is the cable news model. This is the social media model. This is the newspaper model. Everyone is allied with Team Blue or Team Red, and depending on your own identity, your incentives are to only seek out information from those media sources that will reconfirm your pre-existing biases, right? Because you get a dopamine hit from reading about how you're correct about everything and how the other guys are wrong about everything. Okay, I don't think it's just bad for our brains, I think it's also bad for our souls. It decreases our civic charity. Notice how the left-right spectrum promotes intellectual arrogance. It says you don't have to do any hard thinking. You don't have to be intellectually curious. All you have to do is declare for the correct side of a one-dimensional line. And if you've chosen the right side of that line, you're correct about everything. The thinking is over, the conversation is over. This leads to interpersonal hostility because think about how this makes you perceive your fellow citizens. Every single person I encounter is either 100% correct about everything, if they're on the same side of the spectrum as me, or 100% wrong about everything, because they're on the wrong side of the spectrum. So why would I have an intellectually curious conversation? No need. I either know you're right about everything or wrong about everything. Either you're an ally or an enemy who I can get rid of. And in fact, often our politics ends up being not about productive discourse and exchange of ideas. It becomes about how can I dominate the other team? How can I destroy the other team? How can I inflict political violence on these obviously evil people who need to be destroyed? So the myth of ideological polarization, this myth that we can model our politics on a one-dimensional line with two poles, leads to a reality of affective polarization, the reality that we have two political tribes that increasingly hate each other, as the survey data that I showed you earlier pointed to. Okay, so this is the problem, and it leads to totalitarianism. A monist, unidimensional framework necessarily collapses all of the complexity of politics onto a single line. It totalizes our politics onto a single line. This is from Robespierre, the most famous adopter and user of the left-right spectrum that emerged in the 1780s in Paris. He said, "There are only two parties in France, the people and its enemies. We must exterminate those miserable villains who are eternally conspiring against the rights of man. We must exterminate all our enemies." Left-right thinking, monist thinking, led him to a place where he felt justified in murdering thousands of people. George Washington, who was a pluralist, warned Americans against monism in his farewell address. He said, "The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result from monism gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. And sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. America is littered with demagogues today promising, just give me all the power and I will destroy your enemies." Right? This is what Washington warned us about. It's exactly what we're seeing in our contemporary political situation. Okay, so that's the sad, scary part. Now I want to try to turn to what I think could be a solution to the way that we think and talk about politics. And I call this constitutional pluralism, and this emerges out of my work at the Center for Constitutional Studies at Utah Valley University, as Dr. Sanders mentioned. So another BYU alum, a former professor of mine here at BYU, actually founded the Center for Constitutional Studies, Matt Holland, in 2011. And our center prepares citizens with a broad understanding of thought and practices critical to the perpetuation of constitutional government, ordered liberty, and the rule of law. And I believe one of those principles is pluralism. So I want to talk about pluralism and why that's important. We get the idea of pluralism, or at least it's articulated effectively, by one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, James Madison. In Federalist 51, he explained the logic of pluralism and how the Constitution would promote pluralism. In this essay, he's trying to convince the citizens of New York and of America more broadly to ratify the proposed Constitution. And he said one of the benefits of this new Constitution is that it will create a large republic. And in a large republic, people will recognize the truth of pluralism and avoid the danger of monism. He said, "In the extended Republic of the United States and among the great variety of interests, parties, and sects which it embraces, a coalition of a majority of the whole society could seldom take place on any other principles than those of justice and the general good." So if you have a monist political perception of the world, you think of politics in terms of there's just two groups battling over one thing. Well, that framework, that way of thinking about politics, leads to the effort to dominate and destroy and violate the rights of your opponents. But if instead you think about politics as a plurality of groups, individuals, factions, and interests, no one faction or group will ever have a majority of the votes or a majority of the power because there's dozens of them. They're dividing up the population into many small pieces. Each faction and group and interest will recognize that it will always be a minority. And in that situation, it will want to push for constitutional protections of individual rights. And it will push for constitutional restraints on government power. It will want freedom because it knows that it will never be in charge. And since it will always be a minority, it will always want to have freedom. And if it can get anything done, it can only do so by forming coalitions with other groups and factions in society. And those coalitions will recognize that they don't agree about everything, and that's okay. Those coalitions will recognize that there's just a few things that we agree upon, and we can work together for those common ends. In Federalist 51, Madison makes the analogy between religious pluralism and political pluralism. He noted that it was remarkable that the United States of America had religious freedom. How did it have religious freedom? Madison wondered. He said the reason Americans had religious freedom was because of religious pluralism. It wasn't necessarily the theology of the Americans that led them to belief in religious freedom. It was the practical necessity that each state was composed of a variety of different denominations, and no one group would have the majority. And so, as a matter of practical necessity, they had to accept religious toleration and religious freedom for other religious groups. And he says the same thing can happen in the United States when it comes to politics. We can have political freedom and toleration in this country if we recognize the truth of political pluralism. Pluralism, the idea that there are many issues in politics and many groups in politics, leads us to want to constrain the government's power. And President Oakes has talked about the grand fundamentals of the Constitution, which emerge out of a pluralist mindset. He talked about this famously in his General Conference address on the divinely inspired Constitution, saying that the Constitution is not perfect, but its inspiration comes from the way in which it constrains the power of government officials through the rule of law, popular sovereignty, individual rights, the separation of powers, and federalism. When we recognize the truth of pluralism, we will be in favor of these things. If we believe the fallacy of monism, we will be more likely to be against these things. If it's just two groups in society, and I know my group is right about everything and the other group's wrong about everything, who needs the rule of law? Just trample the Constitution and constitutional restraints on government power. Who needs popular sovereignty? We will protest and try to overthrow the outcomes of free and fair elections, because if the other party gets in power, it's the end of the republic. Who needs individual rights? I know I'm right. I can force and shove my policies down the throats of my political opponents. Why the separation of powers? Let's simply concentrate all the power in the hands of a president who can push through our policy preferences, which we know are inevitably correct. Why have federalism? Let's just concentrate power in Washington and have a national government run by us impose our will on our political opponents. Okay, so one of the common misperceptions of our argument is that pluralism cannot operate alongside a two-party system. I just want to briefly address that concern. People say, well, we have a two-party system in American politics. How can we be pluralist? We can do it the same way that Americans did it for most of American history. We've always had a two-party system. But for most of American history, we didn't have the delusion that our parties could be placed somewhere on a one-dimensional spectrum. It's only a recent delusion that we think our two parties can be placed somewhere on a one-dimensional spectrum. For most of American history, people thought of their parties as kind of like grocery baskets. Right? You might think of yourself when you go grocery shopping as shopping for your different issue positions. When you go get your cereal or your bananas or your apples or your ice cream, you're putting things in the cart that you want, that you like, and that might be your issue position on taxes or on international trade or on foreign policy or on abortion or on gun control or whatever it is. But imagine you showed up at the grocery store and you couldn't go inside. The doors were locked, and instead the cashier met you outside with two baskets, a red basket and a blue basket. They said, sorry, you can't go in and choose your groceries. You just have to choose one of these baskets and we'll sell it to you. Well, that's kind of like voting in a two-party system. We can't choose what all the issue positions of the two parties are, but we can choose between those two baskets of issue positions. The rational thing to do in that situation would simply to look through the basket and say, well, each basket has some things I like, some things I didn't want, but this basket has more of the stuff I want. I'll choose that basket. I'll take that one. What would be delusional and irrational is to look at the two baskets and say, aha, this basket has everything that I wanted, and that other basket has everything that I hate and sucks, and it's the worst, right? That would be delusional. They're statistically improbable that those two baskets would just be separated in that way. But that's what the delusion of monism tells us to do. Another common misperception of our argument is people say, well, you believe that no one can be principled in politics, that people can't be philosophical. On the contrary, the reality is you're more likely to be philosophical and principled the more you give up left-right thinking. People who buy into the delusion of left-right thinking are constantly changing their own issue positions to justify what their tribe is doing, and then coming up with a post hoc story to say, well, all along that was actually the progressive position, or all along that was actually the conservative thing to do. People who give up left-right monism can keep their parties at an arm's distance and say, yeah, that party changed on that issue. Now I like that other party's position because they have the issue position that I like. My own issue positions are informed by my philosophy, my values, my beliefs, my principles, and I can look at the two parties and say, in some ways they agree with me, in some ways they disagree with me. That would be rational and normal. So it's actually more principled to not think about a left-right spectrum. Okay, so this is what our church leaders have taught us in recent years. They teach pluralism. President Oaks, famously in his Easter conference address in 2021, said there are many political issues. Notice he says that. There are a plurality of political issues, not just one. And no party, platform, or individual candidate can satisfy all personal preferences. No party will agree with the principles of the gospel of Jesus Christ on everything, because these are man-made institutions. Each citizen must therefore decide which issues are most important to him or her at any particular time. Then members should seek inspiration on how to exercise their influence according to their individual priorities. Notice the use of the plural, not just one priority, multiple priorities, multiple issues. This process will not be easy. It may require changing party support or candidate choices, even from election to election. President Oaks is teaching us that the parties are constantly changing their issue positions. That's normal, but we need to step back and say, well, what are our values? What is our priorities? What are the issues that we care about? And we will change our support for candidates and parties from election to election based on that, rather than simply justifying what our tribe does and always voting for the same candidate or party every year or every election. The First Presidency in 2023 warned members of the church against monism. They said in a First Presidency statement, principles compatible with the gospel may be found in various political parties, not just one. Members should study candidates carefully and vote for those who have demonstrated integrity, compassion, and service to others, regardless of party affiliation. So they're indicating here, these are the priorities that you should care about. You should care about candidates who demonstrate integrity, compassion, and service to others. That's what your priorities should be. Merely voting a straight ticket or voting based on tradition without careful study of candidates and their positions on important issues is a threat to democracy and inconsistent with revealed standards. If we have two tribes that think that their tribe is correct about everything and has always been correct about everything, that's a threat to democracy, because we can't coexist in a pluralistic society if most of our population believes in the fallacy of the left-right spectrum. President Nelson put this poignantly in his address to young single adults around the world in May of 2022, warning young single adults against ideological labels or political labels and making those their most important thing. He said, you are a child of God. You are a child of the covenant. You are a disciple of Jesus Christ. That's what matters. Those are your important identities. I plead with you not to replace these three paramount and unchanging identifiers with any others. If you identify yourself by your political affiliation, right? Oh, I'm a progressive. Oh, I'm a conservative. You will instantly be categorized as having certain beliefs, though I don't know anyone who believes everything that their preferred political party presently embraces. Of course not. Of course there's more than two ways to think about politics. Of course, each party will be correct about some things and wrong about some things. That should be obvious to us. But the lie of left-right monism tells us no, that one party is correct about everything and one party is wrong about everything. Okay, so what sense does it make to use terms like left and right? It only makes sense when we're referring to social groups, because that's what left and right are. They are not coherent trans-historical philosophies. They are ever-changing social groups of individuals. They are tribes. The issue correlation we see among people who call themselves conservatives and people who call themselves progressives is because of socialization, rather than some essence that binds together all of their issue positions. And so it's my encouragement to you today and my invitation to you today to stop using the language of left and right and progressive and conservative and start using social group labels when you want to refer to a group. You can just talk about Democrats and Republicans, or you can talk about Team Blue or Team Red. That accurately infers that I'm talking about a social group whose membership will constantly change and whose issue positions will constantly change. If instead I use the ideological labels, left and right, progressive and conservative, that implies a fallacy, that there is some philosophy binding together all the issue positions of that tribe, which is not true. Okay, so I'm out of time, so I will just conclude by returning to the original question that I began with, which is how can I become a peacemaker? I'll remind you that we all must pray for charity, but we also can learn true doctrine. And I encourage you to embrace the truth of pluralism and leave behind the fallacy of monism that was taught to you by your teachers and professors. So there's 5 things I'll just end with, and maybe we can let people go to their class, and maybe we can do a Q&A after the break. First, I encourage you to recognize that the left-right spectrum is a myth, recognize that it is a fallacy, and rather than using this totalizing language of a monist, one-dimensional spectrum, instead simply go granular. Rather than saying this person is a left-wing environmentalist or this person's a right-wing pro-lifer, just say that this person is an environmentalist or this person's pro-life. We don't have to bring in the unnecessary, confusing, and incendiary language of left and right, as if someone who is pro-life on abortion policy must share some essential kinship with Nazis on the extreme right, or that someone in favor of environmental protection is somehow has an essential connection with communists on the far left. It's just misleading, and it's unnecessary, and it's harmful. Just go granular. Talk about the different issues. Change your language. As I said earlier, use the social group language rather than the ideological language. Refuse to reinscribe the fallacy of monism. Refuse to talk about people in terms of, oh, they're on the left or they're on the right. Or the Republican Party has moved to the left or it's moved to the right. Or the Democrats have moved to the left. It's nonsense. This will be hard. Right? Our brains are wired by language. Our brains are wired by the vocabulary that we've been taught to use. You will step outside this room, I guarantee you, and you will be tempted to use the language of left and right and progressive and conservative because it's around you everywhere. You have to persistently try to change your language. Fourth, I would encourage you to find healthier tribes. Human beings are by nature political animals. We have to belong to social groups. We have to belong to tribes. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just some tribes are better than others. Some social groups are healthy and some are unhealthy. I submit that the ideological tribes are unhealthy. They tell you lies, that you're right about everything, and that you're opposed by people who are wholly evil. Embrace the truth of pluralism. Get involved in your community, in your neighborhood, in your ward. Those service organizations and community organizations that encourage you and teach you to serve and love others rather than to hate and dominate others. So finally, I'll just end by saying that if we can promote constitutional pluralism in the United States and elsewhere, I think we can also promote peacemaking. Thanks so much for your time.